Hi, welcome to My Wine Smarts. I'm Victoria, your wine coach, and this is the episode on the basics of wine. If you've ever wondered what people mean when they say a wine is full-bodied or tannic, this is the right episode for you. Over the next 10 minutes, you'll be introduced to some of the basic terms that wine professionals use to talk about wine. After you've watched this episode, check out some of our other resources on mywinesmarts.com and continue to learn about wine and enjoy it.
Many of us enjoy wine on a daily basis, whether it's to celebrate special occasions or when we gather with friends or simply to enhance a meal. Despite this, wine remains a somewhat intimidating topic. So if you've ever walked inside a wine store and felt completely intimidated by the choices, or if you've ever picked a wine simply because you like the label, this wine primer is for you. Here's what you will learn in this wine primer. First of all, the wine primer will define and explain some of the commonly used terms in the wine industry. It will help you to ask better questions to decide whether you might like a particular kind of wine and why. And it will help you become more comfortable when you choose a wine, whether it's in a wine store or in a restaurant. All of this will also help you build a framework for learning about wine. It will help you get a good foundation so that as you keep learning more about wine, you'll have this foundation to place things in, and you'll be able to relate what you're learning to what you already know, which is the best way to learn and remember things. Before we go on to start defining some of the terms used to describe wine, let's briefly talk about types of wine and narrow down the topic of this primer. Probably the largest category of wine is table wine. Table wine is most simply defined as the fermented juice of grapes. And as we see here, it can be red, white, or rosé. Table wine is what this primer will focus on, and in particular, we'll be talking mostly about red and white wines. Some of the terms that we'll learn and descriptions will apply to rosé as well, but we won't necessarily discuss rosés in any detail. Another big category of wine are sparkling wines. And sparkling wine is simply table wine with carbon dioxide, with bubbles. And then there's fortified wine, which is table wine that has added spirit. As I said, in this primer, we'll focus on table wine. So, to describe wine and to define the terms used to describe wine, let's briefly talk about how we experience wine. First of all, we see the wine when it's poured into the glass. We also swirl and smell it, usually, before taking a sip. Then we taste it, and based on all of these things, we form an overall impression of the wine, and we decide whether we like it or not. As I said, the first thing we experience with wine is sight. So we see the wine as it's poured into the glass. One of the things we notice, of course, is the color of the wine. And depending on whether the wine is white or red, obviously the color is very different. Even among white wines, there is a range of colors. So white wines generally range from pale all the way to golden yellow. Red wines generally range from purple all the way to brick red. In red wines especially, another thing that you'll notice is the intensity of the color of the wine. So some wines are really light in color, even though they're red, and you can almost see through them. Other wines are deeper, still others are almost opaque to where you literally can't see through the wine that's poured into a glass. Another part of seeing a wine is also looking for sediment in the glass. Some wines will have sediment. These days, those are very few and far in between. Most wines will be clear, especially white wines. The vast majority of white wines are clear. Sometimes you'll drink a wine that might not have been filtered. A white wine, if it's not filtered, might have a little bit of sediment. It's important to remember that sediment is not undesirable in wine. However, if you feel uncomfortable drinking it, it's perfectly fine to leave a little bit of wine at the bottom of the glass to avoid the sediment. Sediment is a little more common in red wines, especially red wines that are aged a little bit. And again, it's perfectly fine to leave it in the glass, even though it's not an undesirable thing. To avoid sediment, wine is sometimes decanted. You can also avoid pouring the sediment into the glass by pouring out of the bottle very carefully. The next thing after we see a wine, of course, is smelling it. And as you probably already know, before smelling a wine, it's a good idea to swirl the glass. That's why it's important not to put too much wine in the glass, so you can swirl. When you swirl the glass, you release the aromas of the wine, and so it's easier to detect those aromas. Now, smelling a wine is probably one of the more intimidating parts of experiencing a wine. We've all seen wine professionals and people who know about wine smelling a wine and then using some very specific terms to describe it, including things like dried rose petals, lychee, even things like wet socks. And this can be confusing and intimidating sometimes. So let's talk about some general categories of aromas that are found in wine. And remember that these are just suggestions. Smelling a wine is obviously a subjective experience. So while most of us can agree on some general aromas we discover in a wine, part of what you're smelling will depend on your experiences. Some people just have a better memory for smells than others. But the good news is that as you learn more and as you start paying more attention to wine and the aromas in wine and the aromas in other substances in your daily lives, you'll be better at describing what you smell in a wine. That said, here are some general categories of aromas found in wine. The first one, of course, is fruit, and that can be berries such as strawberries, raspberries, blackberries. It can be tropical fruit. It can be citrus. It can be tree fruit like apples and pears. Another broad category of aromas in wine is minerals. Flint, whetstone, chalk. Generally, these are more common in white wines. Then another common category are spices. Cinnamon, vanilla, cloves, orange peel, licorice, etc. Wine can also have floral smells, such as rose, orange blossom, violet. Sometimes, more rarely, but wine can smell of vegetables like olives and asparagus and bell pepper and mushroom. It can have earthy aromas, aromas of dust or mud or forest floor. There are many other aromas too: cigar, leather, cedar, tar, black tea, tobacco. So as you start learning about wine and experiencing more wines, try to think of what the aromas in that particular wine remind you of. My suggestion when smelling a wine is to swirl it and then close your eyes when you actually smell it. This helps you not be distracted by what's going on around you and focus more on what you're actually smelling in the glass. So feel free to close your eyes, take the first whiff, then take a little break and take another whiff, because often what we smell at first is confirmed, but it can be disconfirmed by the second try. So take one whiff, take a little break, smell the wine again, and think of what it reminds you, what types of aromas you detect. As I said, smelling wine and talking about it can be intimidating, but it's fun to practice with your friends because other people might discover aromas that you didn't think of, or talking through wine with your friends in a non-intimidating atmosphere can really help you become better at describing what you're smelling. So after looking at a wine in a glass and smelling it, we usually move on to tasting it. And for most people who are not wine professionals, this is the most enjoyable part of drinking wine. And most of us decide whether we like wine or not based on what we taste. Let's talk about some general terms that are used to describe how a wine tastes in the mouth. One of the most commonly used terms for describing wine is dryness. So we say a wine is dry. A wine can be dry or off dry or sweet. This is also one of the most commonly misused terms. So let's talk a little bit about what it means when somebody says a wine is dry. A wine is dry if it has no detectable sugar. Wine professionals call that residual sugar, but don't worry about it for now. So wine can be dry when you cannot detect any sweetness. It is off dry if there's just a little bit of sweetness, or it can be sweet, and sweet is usually a dessert wine. Now, the confusion comes in because a lot of people identify what they smell in a wine glass with dryness. So if you smell things like melon or papaya or any kind of fruit, you might automatically think that the wine is not dry, that it is sweet. That's not necessarily the case. A wine can smell perfectly well of a range of fruits, including some that are very sweet, like ripe melon or papaya, and still be a dry wine. Dry simply refers to the way the wine tastes in the mouth. If there is no sugar in the wine, it is dry. The vast majority of wines, whether white or red, are completely dry. There are some notable exceptions. So, for example, all dessert wines are sweet. And then there are some table wines, such as Riesling, that can be off dry. But the vast majority of wine is dry. Another term commonly used to describe wine is acidity. And in terms of acidity, wines can be low, medium, or high in acidity. Acidity is the feeling in the mouth that makes you salivate. So after you've swallowed a sip of wine, if you feel saliva forming in your mouth, it means the wine is high in acidity. Acidity is generally felt on the sides of the tongue. So try tasting a couple of wines and see what happens in your mouth after you swallow them. White wines generally tend to be a little higher in acidity than red wines. Or I guess I should say, in white wines, acidity is more detectable. In red wines, there are other components that come into play that make acidity a little less obvious. And one of those components is tannin, which is the next thing we'll talk about. We often hear this term. It's not often explained what it means. Tannin is simply a substance found in red wines that comes from the skins of the grapes. It can come from the barrel the wine is aged in. Wines can have low, medium, or high tannin. Now, white wines have no tannin, so when we talk about white wines, we don't use the word tannin. We only refer to tannin when discussing red wines. And tannin is that feeling of dryness that a wine gives you that sometimes, if it's present in high amounts, makes your cheeks stick to your gums almost. It's the same feeling you have when you're drinking tea that's been steeped for too long. So if you're drinking black tea that's too strong, there's a drying sensation in your mouth after you take a sip of tea. And that same drying sensation is indicative of the presence of tannins in the red wine. Another term commonly used to describe wines is body. So we hear that wines can be light or medium or full in body, and often it's not clear what that means. Body simply refers to the way the wine feels in your mouth, and you can think of it in terms of viscosity, if you will. So wines that are light have that light, crisp, refreshing feeling in the mouth. And when you swallow them, you don't necessarily get anything lingering in your mouth. Whereas full-bodied wines almost can taste chewy. They're so thick and viscous in your mouth. So white wines can be anywhere from light to full. The vast majority of them will be light to medium. A lot of red wines are medium in body. Also, red wine is often full-bodied. For example, a potent Cabernet Sauvignon would be a full-bodied wine. So we said that when we're experiencing wine, we see it, we smell it, we taste it. And based on all of these things, we form an overall impression of the wine. And what this means is simply we decide if we'll like the wine or not. So we drink wine, we take a sip, and we say, oh, this is great. I like this wine. And we can like it for a variety of reasons. Another issue when evaluating wine and what your overall impression of it is it worth the price? Because it's one thing to like a wine, it's another thing to be willing to pay the price of it. For example, if a wine is light-embodied and sort of an everyday wine, we might like it and agree to pay maybe $10 to $15 for it, but we would never pay $50 for the same bottle of wine. So we decide whether we like the wine, but we also need to think about what the price is and whether we think that wine is worth that price. So what did we learn in this primer? First, we learned that there are 3 main categories of wine: table wine, sparkling wine, and fortified wine. And again, this primer focused only on table wine and mainly on reds and whites. We also learned the 4 main aspects of how we evaluate wine by sight, smell, taste, and overall impression. We learned some tasting terms that are really important and that we hear every day, such as dryness, acidity, tannin, and body. And you can apply all of these things the next time you're buying a wine, whether it's in a store or in a restaurant, or the next time you're talking to your friends about wine, giving them recommendations or getting recommendations from them. These terms are very useful, and the more wine you taste and the more practice you get in using these terms, the better able you'll be to decide if you'll like a particular kind of wine when it's described to you. Thanks for joining us for this episode of My Wine Smarts, and keep tasting wine and keep learning about wine.